So a woven material, typically it's made by, you've got thousands of yarns all sort of going in one direction, and you loop something above and below and above and below those thousand yarns, and you push the yarn together, and you sort of have this matrix shape that you have produced. We at Unspun, we take that process and we found a way to do it in a three-dimensional shape, where we still have thousands of yarns all coming together, and shuttles that are pulling what's called weft yarns around those thousands of yarns that are coming in, and tying them all together, and really building a strong piece of fabric. And so 3D knitting is actually something that has existed for quite some time. And often if you've got a pair of socks, they are 3D knit. 3D weaving, on the other hand, really has not been done before, not to sort of the way and the extent that we are doing it.
20% of wastewater globally is derived from the manufacturing of textiles and garments. And this is higher in places where manufacturing happens, like in India, China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and other parts of East Asia. Most manufacturing sites create products from rolls of fabrics that are then cut into shapes and sewn together. This creates a lot of textile waste from the cutting that typically goes straight to landfill, let alone all the chemical and water usage in the manufacturing for dyeing, processing, and finishing of a garment. The manufacturing of our garments represent an oversized component of the garment's impact due to the raw material inputs, energy intensity, water usage, and chemical usage during the manufacturing. Now, with globalization, most of the world's garment manufacturing happens in the global south. And many of these manufacturing centers don't have strict labor laws, resulting in really poor working conditions for the employees. Brands order their products in large quantities, ship them back to their packaging and warehousing facilities, which influences the burden of inventory problems for brands, resulting in overproduction. Now, this is the problem that Unspun is trying to address. Their proprietary on-demand manufacturing system allows for the garment creation through 3D weaving microfactories, reducing fabric waste that typically goes straight to landfill. Their system allows garments to be made locally in exact measurements, eliminating the need for long transportation lead times. Their system inherently allows brands to limit their overproduction and produce exact garments made to measure. Unspun creates their own software for digital optimization to support the full use of their Vega manufacturing system for brands. They've even tested this out on their own no-inventory denim brand. Dan Robichaud-Carew is the head of software and product management at Unspun. We talk about his transition into the apparel manufacturing center, the desire for impact in his work, the unique process of Vega, and how Unspun's on-demand manufacturing system reduces waste for garment manufacturing. It supports domestic manufacturing and offers opportunity for better fit for consumers, resulting in a win-win-win scenario. Dan, let's just jump right into it. I appreciate you and your time and speaking with us at the Growing Green Ventures podcast. But before we start, I'd love to just understand high level, what is Unspun? What are you guys doing over there in California?
Yeah, so Right. So Unspun, we are a US-based fashion company. We're a fashion tech company. Our goal is to reduce global carbon emissions by 1% through automation and localizing production of garments, and really rethinking the way that we consume and produce garments. And so we at Unspun, we originally started, sort of our first product launch was a direct-to-consumer jeans product where somebody could scan their body and we would make a custom pair of jeans for them. And while we were developing and marketing that product, we sort of in the background, almost in secret, were building what has now become our sort of flagship product, Vega. Vega is a loom that can weave fabric in 3 dimensions, and we think that by being able to weave fabric in 3D, we can really cut down on the waste that goes into producing garments, and we can speed up the process of production, which would allow localized manufacturing and sort of a whole new paradigm for how garments are made. Really excited to be chatting today about that, and I'm sure we'll go into more detail.
Absolutely. No, there's already so much to sort of jump off from there. I think, manufacturing is one of the largest components of a garment's environmental impact, let's just say, or the environmental impact of the fashion industry. So what you guys are doing is really important nevertheless. But well, before we jump into the details of this, Dan, who are you and what is your role at Unspun specifically?
Yeah. So I run our product management here at Unspun. I also manage the software engineering team. And I've been here for about a year and a half now. And yeah, so as product manager, I sort of own unspun.io, our webpage. I owned the mobile app that we've got, the tools that allow a designer to come up with a new design for like a new fabric or a shape or something that they'd like to create on our loom. That all sort of goes through the software team. And sort of what is that like longer term plan for how factories would integrate with Vega and all that sort of comes through me.
Amazing. And from my understanding, you're not originally from the fashion industry yourself. You come from a different background. Can you explain your history and how you got from your education to Unspun right now?
Of course, yeah. So I have spent prior to Unspun about a decade in the education tech space. I moved out to San Francisco back in 2012. It was nerd Hollywood. It was the place to be if you were interested in software, technology, and anything like that. That's like where everything was happening. And as a new graduate with a computer science and electrical engineering degree, it felt like the right place. The thing is, I very quickly saw the beauty and also the ugly side of the tech industry and of startup culture, and decided that I wanted to work in companies that were innovative, fast-paced startups, but also had a mission component to them. And so I generally would stick to education tech companies. At first, it was serendipitous that I ended up in that industry, and over time, I started becoming, this is maybe a good focus for me. During the pandemic, one of the companies that I had been working for was acquired. I helped sort of with the transition, and then ended up moving away from that company and had some time to think through, what I might want to be doing longer term. I had another stint at another ed tech company briefly, but really I was starting to feel like, okay, maybe it's time for a transition. I'm not exactly sure what that transition is. I would like to do something that's related to hardware, something that's maybe a little more physical goods. It's I had been spending so many years in software as a service, and I eventually thought, maybe climate tech. I had a friend who invited me to San Francisco Climate Week, and to me, it was one of the most interesting, exciting, amazing events that I had been to in years. Because for one, with COVID, a lot of the in-person sort of tech scene in San Francisco had dried up. The energy really felt like it had left the building.
A lot.
Yeah, and that was something I really missed. And then I go to this event, Climate Week, run by Climate Base, and what I found was, damn, there is a lot of energy in this space, and there are a lot of companies here in the Bay Area and globally that are working on something really interesting. There's a lot of excitement here, and this is exactly the kind of thing I was looking for. It's impactful work. It's people who really care about what they're doing. It is so much sort of more diverse than the software as a service sort of industry that I had been in terms of the types of solutions. I'm sure that when you're speaking with founders and companies, you find that to be the case of, wow, this person is like working with this highly novel polymer, and this other person is working on like using satellites to map out methane, emissions globally and how we can address that.
Completely.
Yeah. We at Unspun, we're working on software and a giant loom. And I love being able to talk to people who are like, oh, what do you do? You're tech in San Francisco. I'm like, yes, but I'm making a huge freaking loom, and that's super cool.
No, what you're doing is a very, sexy application of technology. I mean, that's sort of the allure of fashion in many ways. And to your point, I think, climate tech and sustainability services, let's say overall, is an extremely interesting space to be in. You know, it's such a broad problem, and it's a problem that a lot of people, obviously ourselves included, and probably many of the listeners of this podcast, are really motivated to address. I mean, it's existential. It's extremely, extremely important, and it touches every facet of life in every industry and every domain. And so, on one hand, that actually can be overwhelming at times, and obviously the reality of the problem is it's quite daunting. But that also presents so many opportunities for so many different people with whatever skill sets and interests that they may have. It's applicable to everyone and everywhere. And so, I think that's the opportunity that this challenge presents ourselves. And what this podcast is really about, to try to highlight how people can authentically address that issue with their own, through their interests and skill sets and things like that. But Dan, you went from ed tech, you're in the tech bubble, mecca of the world, let's say, and you move into this fashion tech space. How has it been, this adjustment from other SaaS-based industries and sectors to now working with clothes and these soft goods, and the people involved in fashion with a capital F? I'd love to hear your take on how that transition's been.
Yeah, it has been a trip. I first of all, there were so many problems that I just assumed had been solved already. I assumed that, like, surely there is an automated sewing machine out there. The sewing machine has existed for almost 200 years, somewhere around there, and still nobody has figured out a way to automate that process. I had been thinking that, there are players out there who are doing exciting things. There's companies that take plastic bottles and turn it into clothing. I felt like maybe there's more innovation and then when I sort of joined and saw the ugly underbelly of the industry and how extremely disgustingly wasteful it is, I was shocked. I learned of a company that yes, they do use plastic bottles to make their clothing, but when they ran out of recycled plastic bottles, they bought new bottles to melt down and turn into.
I've heard about this.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard about that, sir. Isn't that just something? Something.
And so, just shocking. And the fact that, back in the 60s and 70s, 95% of garments made in the US or worn in the US were made in the US. Major well-known brands were industry titans of manufacturing. And over the years, they've become less and less involved with manufacturing, to the point where, many of them, almost all of them, have zero insight into how their own clothes are made. They don't know where it comes from. They don't know what it's, what the every step along the way is. And they try from time to time. There could be some pretty bad scandal of health problem, or Rana Plaza, of course, happened, and all of a sudden these companies take a step back and they say, oh yeah, we're going to make this big commitment to improving the working conditions of people building our products, sewing our products. But of course they don't have any direct control over that. They don't know who all these people are, and maybe they step into one factory and they like what they see, and it turns out, a huge black market of 20 other factories that are not being seen, that are, having terrible working conditions. So I think what blew me away was sort of the lack of innovation. It really has been a race to the bottom of, well, as long as there are more people, we can keep doing what we've been doing. We can keep pushing them harder and keep, just dive into what we've always done. And we in the US, we've made fairly strict environmental policies. We have labor and safety policies. But of course, if you can outsource that, then we Americans, we never see it, right? So we're not seeing the pollution. We're not seeing the human suffering, and it's easy to be disconnected from it. So my take was, when I joined, I thought things would have been better than they are. And now that I see the way things are, I totally understand why our founders started Unspun. I can talk a little bit about that story, and why this is such an important problem to be working on.
So why do you think that fashion specifically has lacked manufacturing innovation as compared to other industries and sectors,
Right.
when there has been such
Right.
amazing advancements across the board, yet, the sewing machine is relatively the same as it was many, many years ago?
Right. Right.
What's your 2 cents on that?
Yeah. So if you think about, to me it sort of boils down to labor, availability of labor. There's a lot of sort of international trade policy that goes into it, and if you think about a industry that we could compare it to, it's agriculture and the food industry. And if you think back, 100, 150 years ago, the the this was when, sort of the industrial revolution was getting to a point where, okay, all of our food is now being produced in giant factories, and we're, cutting up chickens, and we're going to package them, and then sell them in grocery stores. It's a big departure from the way things, previously were. And you think about these stories that authors like Upton Sinclair, that they dove into, of, hey, there are some serious problems here. People are getting really sick. There are rats running around in these factories, and the response was, hey, let's make some regulations. Let's have food safety. Let's have the FDA, and actually take a look into what are these practices and how do we make sure that people don't get sick. The fashion industry, on the other hand, never really. I mean, it did go through that here in the U.S. Of course, there were, hey, let's have more safe factories. Let's not pollute as much. There was the EPA. There's OSHA, right? That they sprung up. But over time, with global trade, you could push those problems away, and you could say, okay, I don't really need to make a more efficient factory, because I can just go find cheap labor somewhere else. I can find a government that is just eager to have sort of any type of work for their population, and they're okay with that pollution, because there's sort of this narrative that you will go through that for a while. Your population will get rich, and then eventually you'll be able to stop the pollution where you are, and push it off onto somebody else. And I think everybody has sort of accepted that as, like, that's just the way of the world. That's the status quo. We'll just pollute somewhere and move on to the next place, and pollute that place and move on to the next place. And, because clothes don't expire in the way that food does, you don't really have to worry about sending a chicken over from a factory in Bangladesh, but you could do that with clothing, and everything's okay. So I think that's such a big part of it is that global trade policy.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that makes total sense, and I couldn't agree more. I think it's a narrative that we need to start to change, but really, there is the legislative component of this, which I'd love to get into and get your 2 cents on later in this conversation. But I think one thing that you guys are doing that's just really exciting is the opportunity of onshoring, and doing so that brings in high-skilled jobs, and that sort of near manufacturing to the consumer and to the consumption of said good is a component that just by design is more environmentally friendly. And those types of no-brainer solutions are what should be encouraged by policymakers and by brands overall. Now, again, before we go too much into the actual operations of Unspun and the technology behind it, you mentioned something that I really want to harp on, which is your goal behind your 1% carbon emissions reduction. I see this a lot in Unspun's website and things of that nature. It seems like that a lot of your work stems from that. Why? What's the story behind this mission statement, and how is everything else tied into that? Basically, and in part of that, how is your business transitioning this industry into a more circular or more environmentally friendly sector, high level?
Yeah, of course. So we at Unspun, we've got sort of three founders. There's Beth, Walden, Kevin. Mm-hmm. Beth was working, this was before Unspun was founded. She was working at a well-known outdoor brand. I won't name names, but a well-known outdoor brand that was making tents. And what happened at the end of the season, at the end of the sort of season for those tents, despite this brand being a sustainability-minded brand, the question came up with, hey, what do we do with all these extra unsold tents? And you could give them away. You could give them to homeless shelters. You could give them to people who are, youth programs of trying to get kids out into the wilderness. Any number of opportunities for what you could do with these tents. You could sell them at a steep discount. But this brand the decision was made to burn the tents. The reason was we don't want our tents to be sort of commoditized. This needs to be, a sort of pseudo luxury type of product. That was something that really blew our founder's mind, right? And where I've spoken about in my perspective of being blown away by the waste. It wasn't until I saw these types of things firsthand that I realized how bad things were. Our other founder, Walden, he was working at an athleisure brand. He was working on their strategy, and he also saw their problem with what they did with their unsold inventory. And even if, and I can, maybe we'll dig into this a little bit later, but if you are a brand and you say, okay, I have found a way to make the most sustainable t-shirt ever. This t-shirt uses 0.0001% of a typical t-shirt's emissions. But if you make way, way, way too many of these t-shirts and you don't sell them, then what do you do with that unsold inventory? Again, it ends up often in landfills. It's adding to pollution, and you're still working, making so much waste just in the process of producing that excess inventory. So when we at Unspun were thinking about how we can, when we were being founded and thinking about how can we rethink this problem, it's not just about how do we produce things in a more sustainable way, but also how do we consume our garments in a more sustainable way. And it's, our long-term vision is there could be a point where somebody says, hey, I would like a pair of jeans. I would like a shirt. And I want it to be this size and this color. And here's my, here are my measurements. And some factory using Unspun tech, at the moment of you purchasing that garment, it could spin up. It can make a garment for you, send it to you within a few days. And instead of having a huge pile of inventory that ends up going to waste, you have sort of this made-to-measure, on-demand structure where now we're not overproducing and things are not being made that don't fit anybody and that people don't have demand for. So when we think about that 1% carbon reductions goal, if we think about the fashion industry overall, it's a little bit hard to pin down exact numbers of what is the carbon footprint of the fashion industry. One of the reasons for this is the industry is so opaque. It's very hard to really understand who's doing what, where. Yeah. But generally, the accepted range is between 4 and 10% of all global carbon emissions are coming from the fashion industry. And so we at Unspun basically thought, well, if we can change the way that things are manufactured fundamentally and make it so it's the cheapest, most efficient way of manufacturing, and it's much less wasteful, then we could hit a goal like that, that 1% global carbon emissions. It's a small number, but a huge impact.
Yeah, for sure. No, that makes total sense. And I think with your technology, especially once it scales and gets into full operation, et cetera, can absolutely make that. And obviously there are other players in this sort of 3D weaving space, but those types of technologies are really necessary to achieve that. Quickly, do you have off the top of your head an estimate of if you're looking at like a garment from a life cycle assessment point of view, do you know the general percentage that the manufacturing stage, basically the components that Unspun is either doing or replacing through its unique proprietary system would represent in a garment's environmental impact?
Yeah. So if we're thinking about sort of every step along the way for a garment, there's the farming, there's if you're using a natural, but even if not, if you're making like polyester or something like that, you are producing the fiber, and then you're taking the fiber, you're weaving it, then you're taking that woven fabric, you're cutting it, creating a garment, you're cutting it, sewing it. Just from that stage alone, you're seeing about 10 to 20% of the fabric is wasted because it's not used. You have a big flat sheet and you cut out the shape of a pair of pants, and what is left over usually goes to waste. So there's cutting, there's sewing, there is then transportation, storing it, eventually selling it, transporting it again potentially, and then there's end of life of what happens to the garment. So we at Unspun, our focus is sort of condensing a lot of those steps down into one. We go directly from fiber to finished garment, sort of all in one process. And in doing so, we significantly cut down the waste of that traditionally flat woven fabric. We're weaving directly into a near finished shape. So we can weave a garment that will have, like, let's say, one way to think of it is if you're making a pair of pants, we can weave one tube of that pant, another tube of that pant, make a small cut and sew them together. And in doing so, we're significantly reducing the waste that goes into making a pair of pants, because we're not having as much offcuts that are being thrown out. We're not transporting fiber from one country to another. We're just buying the fiber, or we're buying the yarns and going to that finished product. And so I couldn't tell you exactly what the percentage is. We do have an LCA on our website, and you could dig into that a little bit more. But
Sure.
Definitely, I would say the vast majority of the waste from the garment industry is in the production side. Yeah.
No, 100%, absolutely, and again, like the fact that you're able to skip so many steps, reduce the waste component and inventory challenge of manufacturing. So you're making things on demand, cuts out so much waste, close to the consumer, it's close to the distribution centers, it's close to the retail X, Y, and Z, assuming that you have these like onshore, near site micro factories, as the literature states. You're really taking away a lot of the variables that would otherwise cause a larger environmental impact. But I'm curious, I know that manufacturing is a broad piece of the pie, and there's a lot of different types of manufacturings and finishing components of a garment. Does Unspun have any sort of impact around like the water usage or the dyeing components of said garment? Does it address that side of it? I know that, like, for example, specifically with jeans, the actual finishing of the jeans, whether it be fading or whatnot, actually is a huge environmental component. I'd love to know if Unspun has an answer to that challenge.
So something that Unspun went through, and I briefly mentioned this on our LCA, it is, if you want to find it, unspun.io/impact. We
We'll have a link to the bio.
yeah, exactly. So we project a reduction in blue water consumption of 39%, and there is a question of, like, what is our LCA? What is an LCA? What are we talking about in it? And where do these come from? Traditionally, LCAs within the fashion industry have been done on a sort of a per product basis. And you're thinking, and I sort of mentioned this before, you're thinking about, okay, I've come up with a new t-shirt. It's made from recycled materials, and we find that this t-shirt, in the way that we produce it, significantly has a much lower impact than other t-shirts. And you sort of kind of leave it at that. And we did, as far as we can tell, and as far as some industry experts have told us, we think it's the first time that any company has done a sort of full company, full vision LCA, where we're saying, okay, think about the entire life cycle of that garment from production to end of life, and think about that for every garment that we're making. And we at Unspun, we think about, okay, how do we reach these really aggressive goals? I had mentioned to you before, a long-term vision is you take an individual who is interested in buying some kind of garment. Maybe they're on a website, maybe they're at like a showroom floor or something like that. They say, I want this thing in this size, and we produce it for them at that point. We also think about, how do we make this a circular product? How do we have it something that at the end of life of that garment, we can recycle it in an easier way, and we can potentially reuse those yarns. And we'll get into that a little more in detail later. But when we think about our life cycle assessment, it is all products for their entire life cycle, and not just one-offs. And as I had mentioned before, if you're looking at that t-shirt that's made from recycled materials, you might think about how it is much more innovative and much more sustainable to produce it in a certain way. But if you're not thinking about, okay, but we are producing 100 million of these and only selling 50 million of them, you're not really taking into account the impact that has. So from our perspective,
sure.
Taking that full perspective is helpful.
Absolutely. And again, other things that I've mentioned on your website, and the environmental impact of an unspun garment, end of life is extremely important. And I think a lot of the times companies talk about something being recyclable and biodegradable or X, Y, and Z, and they state that their product has the potential for a positive end of life solution, right?
Right.
But of course, there doesn't take into consideration the external infrastructure that is required to get it to that point. And a lot of the times, just the lack of success at these. Let me rephrase that. The lack of success when it comes to actually achieving a product's intended end of life solution. Now, you can please speak more to this, but from my understanding, what is unique about Unspun is the fact that it's a pre-weaved garment, and it's a pre-knitted tube, as you guys like to use. The end of life of an unspun product could just be unweaving the singular fibers and being able to reuse that in the same system. But what are the other conversations around recyclability or biodegradability of a garment? Can you speak to just how Unspun looks at end of life of garments in general?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. It is, if you look at our name, Unspun, it is this is fundamental to our vision. I think it would be helpful to for me to maybe clarify, maybe some listeners don't know the difference between a woven and a knit garment, and sort of what exists out there. Yeah. So a knit garment, you could think of like a pair of socks, a sweater. Often it's something that sort of has an inherent stretch to it, even if there's no elastane in it. It's a looser way of creating a garment, and it's easier to make in a 3D shape. It tends to be a little bit slower and often much less sort of strength. So if you were to pull something, think about a pair of jeans, right? A pair of jeans is a woven material. A bed sheet is a woven material. These are things that if you pull on them hard, they stay strong. Whereas if you were to take a pair of socks and keep pulling, you could keep going and going and going till it breaks. So a woven material, typically it's made by, you've got thousands of yarns all sort of going in one direction, and you loop something above and below those 1,000 yarns, and you push the yarn together, and you sort of have this matrix shape that you have produced. We at Unspun, we take that process, and we found a way to do it in a 3-dimensional shape, where we still have thousands of yarns all coming together, and shuttles that are pulling what's called weft yarns around those thousands of yarns that are coming in, and tying them all together and really building a strong piece of fabric. And so 3D knitting is actually something that has existed for quite some time. And often if you've got a pair of socks, they are 3D knit. 3D weaving, on the other hand, really has not been done before, not to sort of the way and the extent that we are doing it. So something that you can do when I think about that song, if you want to destroy my sweater, hold this string while I walk away, something like that, right? that is a knitted garment, right? And somebody can hold that string or hold that yarn, and the guy walks away, and the whole sweater falls apart. And that's great. That cannot be done with a pair of jeans. A pair of jeans, you could pull off, one yarn at a time. You could at most get a yarn that's the length of the pair of jeans, but that's it. So what we've done at Unspun with our 3D weaving is we have taken, we've got 6 shuttles on our machine. They pull fabric into sort of a spiral shape, and the garment ends up with a yarn that is very, very long and can be unwoven and pulled off of the garment and turned back into one very, very long yarn that could be reused again. And we've done some proof of concept examples of this where we've woven something and then we have pulled off what we call the weft yarn, which is this, for us, very, very long piece of yarn, and rewoven with it. And so from a circularity perspective, often what brands will do when something has reached end of life is often sort of like a downcycling, where, okay, we're taking this denim back and we're shredding it up, we're applying some chemical process to it, and we're turning it into something that could be reused again in some way. Maybe it's used to...
Of a lower value, most likely.
Yeah. Maybe it's used to fill a pillow. We know there's this awesome brand that does it with like dog beds. And it's great, but again, it's lower value, and it means that to get to the top of that sort of value chain again, you need to have virgin products coming into it. You need brand new cotton, you need brand new yarns. And what our goal is, you could take that yarn from our garment and reweave with it, and see a lot more circularity there.
You talk about your garment not having any seams, and it's sort of this one cohesive tube that has been weaved together. A couple of questions I have around that. Does your machine does it require specific types of fibers? I mean, I've seen images of this machine, and it seems like there's a lot of intensity around it. Do you guys only use synthetic fibers at this point? I mean, can you guys use organic materials? Can you use delicate materials like wool or cashmere, silks and things of that nature? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are definitely material agnostic. We have done all kinds of experiments with crazy types of yarns. We had a show at New York Fashion Week a while back, and if you look at some of the garments that people are wearing there, there's crazy stuff. We made a pair of pants out of that material that like friendship bracelet. Our friendship bracelets are made of. I think it's called Rex lace. It's this like crazy sort of like stretchy plastic. We've used piña, which is like made from pineapple husks. We've definitely used polyester. We most of our machines like today are running cotton. We really like organic cottons, and you know, to us, some of the challenges have been around sourcing yarns and finding, you know, a yarn supplier who is willing to work with our, like, sort of, we're in this medium stage of we want to buy a lot of yarn, but not like an insane amount of yarn. and so, you know, finding those yarns is we are now forming connections with some really innovative, yarn companies out there that are doing really awesome stuff. But yeah, we can be fairly flexible with the yarns that we take. Now, as far as like very delicate yarns, that is something that we're still sort of learning. We can sort of like slow the machine down and be a little more thoughtful with how we take things in. There's also like seasonal things that happen. Right now it's winter, or approaching winter, and the air is drier, and we find that yarns break more easily when the air is dry. And so we've got these huge humidifiers now in our factory that are just like blowing clouds, literal clouds of air. Yeah.
That's funny. That's something you wouldn't think about, but that makes a lot of sense. Now, again, maybe you can speak more to this. Before when I was doing my research for this call, I'm hearing constantly about the fact that, you know, garments are effectively just different dimension tubes. And that's what makes your system effective in a way, because you guys can create these different dimensions of tubes and thicknesses and whatnot, so to create the actual effect. But is there particular types of garments that are more suitable for your machine at this point? I'm thinking of the discrepancy between a pair of jeans or a T-shirt and like an outerwear coat. Maybe a performance garment that has a lot of layers to it and whatnot. And at the same time, I'm curious if you've had any positive or negative, actually, reaction from the design community in that you aren't able to have certain seams that have been the bedrock of so many garments and is basically like it's like the rule book in a way of traditional garment making. So I'd love to hear your 2 cents on those 2 things.
Yeah. So the first question being the optimal garment structure for your machines.
Right.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Is there an optimal? Yeah.
Yeah. So we definitely, we started off as a jeans company, and one of the reasons that we
Hmm.
focused on that was it's a hard problem. Fit for jeans, especially if you're somebody who's got hips,
Hmm.
if you're somebody who traditionally has had a hard time
Tall.
finding
Yeah.
right, finding a great fit, it can be tough. And one way that jeans companies have dealt with that moving forward has been adding more elastane to their jeans. And so you have to go to like a vintage jean shop if you want to find something that's more traditional, more sort of sturdy
Hmm.
denim that doesn't have stretch. So we
Hmm.
started with that problem, and in designing Vega, that was the first thing that we really focused on. But as we have expanded our understanding for what we can do with the machine, as we have iterated on, we're now on our second version of the machine, and we've already got ideas for what our third iteration would be. We found that we can do home goods, we can do children's shirts, we can do dresses, and so definitely like there are physical limitations of, okay, if a machine can take 2,600 yarns in, what is something that feels dense enough, high quality enough, um, with that number of yarns? And so we're finding what those limits are.
Hmm.
Generally, we can do any type of pair of pants that you throw at us, of any size. But if you're thinking about, yeah, like a full sized jacket that is a very sort of high density performance material, that requires maybe 10,000 yarns or something like that, we're not there yet. Though we definitely see the
Understood.
path for what it would take to get there. From
Hmm.
a designer's perspective, what has their feedback been to the garments that we've made and what's
Seamless,
possible on
yeah,
our machines?
seamless garments. Yeah,
Yeah,
seamless garments.
I would say it's something that I was expecting there to be maybe more pushback on than what we found. For a seamless, if you look at our pants, you really most people don't notice that there's no seam there, unless it's like really meant to be like highly visible pleats or something along those lines. And in that case, we can do a few small modifications, sew something into to make it possible. On the other hand, designers have been very excited about some of the things that are possible with our product that really are not possible, in the existing way of manufacturing. So if you think about traditionally, you're buying these huge sheets of fabric, cutting from them and sewing them together. At Unspun,
Hmm.
you will know exactly where in the pant you are at the point of weaving. And so you could say, I want to have a more dense weave structure at the knees. I want this product to
Mm.
have more durability in certain parts and more breathability in other parts. And because you know while you're weaving where that will be, you can be a lot more specific in targeting certain patterns, certain shapes. You could
Hmm.
weave in the person's name into the fabric itself. And we've
That's
done that
cool.
before. We've woven our
Yeah.
founder's face and one of our like investors' faces into a piece of fabric. So we have
I
a
love
lot
it.
of flexibility there, full jacquard capabilities. Jacquard being
Yeah.
basically, you control every yarn that's coming in individually.
Yeah.
Um,
No.
and so that really unlocks a lot of, I think, exciting things that when we've spoken with
Mm.
some performance companies where they're saying, okay, you might not have that extremely high density, waterproof jacket right now, but we can make
Hmm.
a pair of hiking pants that feel better than anything else that's been made before.
Hmm.
I happen to be of a body shape that has fit a lot of the garments that we've made here at Unspun during our prototyping,
Lucky.
and so I've got to try a lot of them
Yeah.
on, and it is wild trying something on where the density is different in one part, and I'm like, it feels warm. My thighs feel warm. Like, what's going on here? And they're like, oh yeah, we did this.
Yeah. That's cool, man. That's cool.
Yeah.
I love that. I I know there's been some highly publicized partnerships that have come out in the recent years, specifically with Decathlon and Walmart specifically.
Yep.
But typically, when we look at innovations in this sector, specifically with manufacturing, you know, they come at a high cost because there's a lot of R&D that has gone into the Vega product, let's say, and manufacturing system.
Yep.
That may that may result in a higher cost for your consumers, for your brands. And so I'm curious to know, who are the types of
Mm-hmm.
what are the types of brands that are approaching you and having those conversations and making orders with you guys?
Yeah,
Is there a specific archetype that usually falls within that, or?
for sure, for sure. We've got a few different types of archetypes that we think of, um, but I would say we we are realists here, and we recognize that fashion has forever been a race to the bottom. And if Unspun
Mm,
cannot be a cost-effective solution, uh, it will be no more really than a occasional, like, hey, this is a fun, cool collab we're doing for sustainability. And maybe Unspun will appeal to a few sustainability-minded businesses, but if we want to have that 1% global impact that we're talking about, this needs to be something that a highly cost competitive company is willing to swallow. And that's why a partnership like we have with Walmart and with Decathlon is so important, because if we can make something that fits their price appetite, we could make something for anybody. So
absolutely.
a few of the sort of archetypes that we might think of brands that are talking to us. One could be, it's a brand that's concerned about upcoming regulations, and they say, "Hey, I need to be a lot better with the way that I am doing my production. I need more clarity into the supply chain." And so those companies that are thinking in that way. They might come to us and say, "Hey, what can we work on together?" Um, and how can we think about this in a better way? In the European Union, they've got a regulation coming up called the digital passport, and that means that garments need to be traceable all the way, from start to finish. And with the way that we do things at Unspun, it's a lot easier for us to help with that traceability. We know where the yarn is coming from, and everything after that is done in our facility, essentially.
Hmm.
Um, another sort of archetype who might be interested in Unspun is the one that's saying, hey, how do I do more onshore manufacturing? Either because of sort of the winds of politics, or because of what we found during the COVID pandemic of having surety of supply. You want to be sure that there's not going to be some geopolitical event or global pandemic where all of a sudden all of your suppliers can no longer supply you, and you are at the bottom of their priority list, and all of a sudden your
Yeah.
supply chain is dried up. So having a little more control over the supply chain, local manufacturing really is helpful there. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Business continuity is actually a component. I speak with companies and their product development or sustainability teams continuously, and something that comes up as a driver for these types of adoptions internally is actually business continuity, and the ability to be able to continue doing what they do normally, whether it be making shoes or jeans or bottles or whatever it may be. And we're
Yep.
seeing so many examples, and we will continue to see many more, specifically if governments and larger corporations don't get their act together, which is in question.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
which will continue to be a challenge. And so I think that's a huge way, I guess, of approaching or positioning sustainable solutions as a win-win for companies. And it sounds like exactly what you're doing. And that's why, again, like onshoring is that kind of concept of like security of product and inventory, business
Exactly.
continuity, and
Exactly.
environmental component. But regulation needs to always be in every conversation, in my opinion, when it comes to sustainability. So in California, we're seeing a bill, California Senate Bill 707, which is making apparel producers responsible for the take-back programs, recycling infrastructure, reuse, et cetera. Basically, an extended producer responsibility act for garment manufacturers. We're seeing something similar come out, being, let's say, discussed in the New York State Congress. And I'd love to know what is Unspun's reaction when it comes to extended producer responsibility acts, mandated take back programs, other sort of legislation that will impact directly the fashion industry? Do you see that as a pro? Do you see your solution as do you see your product as a solution to these bills? I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah. So first of all, I think if we think about these regulations and the purpose behind them, and how do we actually reach carbon negative, carbon neutral goals, we at
Hmm.
Unspun believe that regulation is absolutely necessary for us to hit some of these goals. Now, Unspun, as I sort of mentioned before, Unspun, we believe we can only be successful if we are competitive from a market, from a production cost standpoint. So that will always be our North Star of, can we do this while also being cheaper than what already exists? The only way you would be able to onshore is if you could make the whole process cheaper. Because companies are just profit driven. They have to be there. They've got, that is the nature of being a publicly traded company. On the other hand, when you have this race to the bottom, that continues and continues without clear regulations, it is going to be very difficult to see some of the change that we want. Okay, maybe we onshore manufacturing, but how about the production of those yarns? How about the dyeing and washing and where that all happens? And do we do these things in Mexico and then not quite hold ourselves to those same levels of accountability? So the way that these regulations are thinking is the things that we actually, as industry, do have control over. We may not be able to control that factory in Bangladesh, but we can say, okay, well, if you're selling a shirt, you need to be taking that shirt back at the end of life and have a plan for it. You need to be able to tell us where it came from, because otherwise it just goes into this big black hole. So I think Unspun, we believe we are a solution to these regulations. We think these regulations are important, and without them, it'll take us a much longer time as an industry, if ever, to reach sort of the level of sustainability that's needed.
What can you say to the scalability of your solution? Like, what is holding back scaling your product in Vega even further than what you guys are already doing now?
There are a lot of things, right? First of all, we're a new technology, and as such, if you're a business that is, if you're a legacy fashion brand and you've done things the same way for decades, I design my fall 25 things in fall of 24. I order them all at the beginning of the next year, and they all come in from overseas, and we stock our shelves and we sell 80% of them, 70% of them. Half of them are returned. We trash a bunch. We give a bunch to clearance. If you've always done things the same way and you've been able to optimize every step of that process, thinking from a more fundamental, how are things even manufactured perspective, can be tough. And a lot of these traditional companies have very decentralized decision-making processes. We might talk with an innovation team that says, I love this, and they have a hard time convincing their product team. Maybe we talk to the product team, they love it, and they have a hard time convincing their biz dev team. That's, I think, one of the issues is sort of this decentralized decision making. The fact that companies do tend to be risk averse when they've got something that's already working. Nobody wants to be the CEO who takes a big risk and ends up failing. We saw this happen with, I think it was the Gap. They went through a process of years back going for really being strong with body inclusivity and offering extended size ranges for all of their garments at all of their stores. And what ended up happening was a sort of logistical nightmare, and having all that inventory and being able to sell it all. It was a really, I think, excellent vision, and the business case seemed to make sense, but the execution, for whatever reason, it just didn't work out. And so as a result, the CEO had to drop down, or step down, and so companies don't want to be in that position. You've got something that works. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So this is where those types of regulations come into play of, hey, it is broke, and you need to fix it. And so that's where, Walmart is a great example of a company that they call themselves the Fortune 1 company. It's impressive when you're talking to them. They are the Fortune 1 company. And
they can back that up,
Yeah. And they see 20 years down the line, where are they going to be and where do they want to be? And they can make those types of investments because they've got the money to spend on it. They've got the people who are thinking in that way, and it's important to them, and so they can take a risk like that. And we're finding that because a company like Walmart is willing to do that, now we've got other ones, sort of knocking on our door and saying, "Hey, can we talk? What do you got for us?" Right?
Yeah, for sure. Dan, to that point, I'm curious. You guys are engaging with these brands. You guys are innovating in the manufacturing space. But what can you say to fiber producers, textile manufacturers, other manufacturers in the industry, as well as brands? What should these other stakeholders be doing to address their environmental impact, let's say, especially those that are maybe operating in a more traditional business model and manufacturing method as opposed to yours?
So yeah, so for brands, when it comes to how, especially if you're like a more traditional brand, how can I become more sustainable? How can I go for something like this? The fact will always be that brands are profit focused. Now, there are some well-known brands that are still family owned, and they tend to be willing to try things out a little bit more with, let's do a little bit of local manufacturing. Let's see how we can do this in a sustainable way. But if you're at a company that's fundamentally profit focused, you need to find things that are aligned with generating revenue, things that are aligned with that profit focus that also can be sustainable. And we've seen that some of them find interesting ways of doing it where they make it a really core part of their marketing. And when it becomes an appealing part of your brand to begin with, where customers are seeking you out because they feel better buying from you, then you can spend a little more effort on these sustainable aspects. You also, I think, can think. I would encourage brands to take that step back and think a little bit more about, okay, if I were to rethink my supply chain and rethink the way I design things and how I do inventory and stocking things and how do I handle returns and communication with customers, there may be more opportunities than they think for becoming more sustainable in a way that helps to, maintain profitability and reduce costs. There are brands out there that they've got return rates of up 40% or higher of garments that are coming back. And if they can just have a better conversation with their customer early on, that might just significantly improve how many people are returning and the costs for restocking and if they even do restock. So I think there are ways. There's low hanging fruit, and then there's some of these more fundamental, like, would it be beneficial for me to onshore my manufacturing? Yes, it'll cost more in the short term, but can I try it with a sort of pilot program, see how that goes, and expand it? You have to tie the two together of sustainability and still making money, for better or worse.
How should consumers think about manufacturing when it comes to their garments and impacting their purchasing decisions? Should made in Italy, made in China matter? Should that be a weight to people's considerations? What can you say about that?
Yeah. So some things that were really helpful for me when I entered this industry, 2 books that I would definitely recommend. One, Unraveled, The Life and Death of a Garment. And this is by Maxine Beda. Another one is To Die For, How Toxic Fashion is Making Us Sick, and How We Can Fight Back by Alden Wicker. These really taught me a lot and helped me form my opinion for this question of what should I do personally as a consumer, and what is something that's reasonable to ask, because we're busy people, and it's hard to know, even if a brand says, hey, we make this in a sustainable way. Is that always true? Can I do all the research every time I buy any individual thing to know, was this made in an ethical way? Was this produced sustainably? So for one, and this is maybe paradoxical coming from a company that our whole point is producing garments and hopefully selling garments. Stop buying Stop buying
Yeah.
clothes. Buy less. And this is even the case when it comes to like, should I buy an electric car? You can do the math and say, how much do you use that car? Do you already have a 10-year-old Prius or a 15-year-old Corolla? And just keeping that alive might be more sustainable than
Absolutely.
buying that new electric car.
Absolutely.
Right? So buy less. What you have, if you can learn how to mend it, try to mend it. It can make it look even cooler. If you can't do that, don't have the time for it, if it's just like totally busted and stained and everything else, look at buying secondhand. So these are all like simple things that we can do. But then when it does come to does location of where it's made matter and all of that, I think it is helpful to buy locally. Try to find a local somebody who's selling things that are for us in the US, things that are made in the US. I think fundamentally we have lost sight of how much effort it really truly does take to produce a garment. There's this great video. There's this great video on YouTube, and I apologize, I forget the name, but it shows this woman in Japan who takes every step to make a pair of jeans, very clearly inspired by Levi's, and she does everything from going from that piece of fabric all the way down to cutting, sewing, adding the rivets, adding the buttons, everything, and it takes her, I think, over an hour. And this is a highly skilled individual. And if I think, how much would it cost for somebody in San Francisco, somebody in New York, somebody in Tokyo to spend a whole hour of their life making something that's high quality, and they have that unique skill set, and what would be, the right salary for somebody like that, and how much should that pair of jeans cost? We're talking hundreds of dollars here for a pair of jeans that's that quality. But we've become so accustomed to pair of jeans should be $20, that we've lost sight of the true cost of production. And so if we can start to reframe that in our minds, I'm going to buy something and it's going to last. And when it gets a little tear in it, I'm going to try to fix that, like they sort of used to do in the old days. I think that's just a great way to sort of start thinking about things. You don't really have to. Having a few simple rules, I think, is helpful, rather than trying to be the perfect person. And if you've got something that is already in your closet and it's made, potentially in a not ethical way, that's fine. You've already got it. The damage has been done. Don't throw it out just so that you can buy something made in the US. Keep wearing it, and let it live its life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. No, Dan, I think I couldn't agree with you more. There's well, I'll take that out. It doesn't matter. Dan, I appreciate you so much for yours.
I'll hear it.
Dan, I was gonna say, no, there's like this hierarchy of just like sustainable options, which is like, don't buy secondhand, buy recycled, reused, and blah, blah, blah. And then buy new is obviously at the bottom of it. It's just like a no-brainer to so many things. Yep. Have you, since on this journey of becoming a sustainable fashion operator, have you started to buy secondhand more? What else? You talk about your own change in your consumer behavior. Like, what else has changed? Has your style changed now, being in this industry itself? Or
I thought it would when I first joined. I spent so much time on like Made in America websites, and like, there's some really cool brands out there. I was like talking to my wife, and I was like, yeah, I think I'm gonna invest like a bunch of money into a new wardrobe, and then I never did. And in fact, I don't think I've bought new clothes in, like, other than one like promotional T-shirt to help support like a local nonprofit. I don't think I've bought new clothes in like maybe 2 years. And now for one thing, because we produce jeans here, we do get free jeans as employees. We get 2 pairs per year.
Nice. But they're custom fit. They're designed for perfection thanks to the Vega machine. So you're good to go. Two jeans is fine.
Yep.
I love that.
Yep. Exactly.
Dan, one last question that I'll let you be. What does success look like for you in the next 5 to 10 years with Unspun, and with you personally as well? Yeah.
So we at Unspun, we we've announced our partnerships with Walmart and Decathlon. We've got a few more that we have not yet announced. And we, at this stage, are sort of coming to the end of our first big round of R&D and moving into the scale phase. And so it's now a question of, we've got 3 giant machines here in our Oakland factory. And within a few months, that number will blow up to somewhere between 6 and 10 machines. And do we as a company have enough people to operate these, to build these? How will we integrate with factories in a more sort of reliable, repeatable fashion? When we look at some of the agreements that we've got with Walmart, Decathlon, a few other brands, we are anticipating 5 to 10 years from now producing millions of garments. And in order to do that, that means significant scaling of the machines that we have and our processes, and the company fundamentally changing from this sort of like small, fun, agile startup to something that is really, to some of these businesses core to their manufacturing, to some of our manufacturing partners, we are, being a really big player in the way that they think about production and working and moving forward. So for us as a company, it's okay. The rubber is now hitting the road. We've been doing a lot of research, and we feel good about what we have right now. We can make garments that look great, that feel great. And so how do we scale that up big time? 10 years down the line, it's more of those sort of visionary type of things of how do we make something that fits everybody? So we're not just thinking about changing production, but how do we change consumption? And the way that somebody buys something and they say, when I buy this, I know it will fit from day one. We've got our custom jeans line that with that, we do guarantee that our clothes will fit. And if they don't, we'll make it again until it does. How do we take that side of our business and plug it into our 3D loom, our rapid manufacturing, localized manufacturing? And that's going to be one of the big questions. For me personally, I intend to be here for that journey.
Awesome.
I run our product management team, and we're growing. I'm hiring an engineering manager, if you know any. So yeah, that's
awesome, man. Well, Dan, I appreciate you so much for your time today. I think you've honestly been super insightful, and I think I think what you guys are doing at Unspun is truly revolutionary. And honestly, I only wish success for you guys in the future. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to when our paths meet again soon.
Thank you, Yusuf. It's been great chatting with you, and really looking forward to where you take the podcast moving forward.